Acquisitions by the big N are rare events indeed, so it was curious to come across the news of the acquisition by Nintendo of Shiver Entertainment. The information was announced through the company's investor relations website, information on screen, but details are a little sketchy. So in this video, I'm just going to do a quick deep dive into the acquisition and see what we can find. First of all, let's remember Nintendo's historic reluctance for acquisitions. This is not their go-to approach, and although there are a few examples of them acquiring studios, most recently with Luigi's Mansion 3 devs Next Level Games, the logic seems to be that acquiring studios do not guarantee the human resources that populate those studios. In the West particularly, turnover of staff is quite high, so you could end up with the shell of the company, but none of the people who made the company what it is if those people move on swiftly. Therefore, even companies Nintendo is incredibly reliant upon, such as Intelligent Systems, who work on multiple major titles for Nintendo and have worked on lots of vital programming tech for them as well. As I covered in this video here, linked in the blurb, they remain independent studios of Nintendo when you might expect an acquisition to take place. Having said that, this is not a complete bolt from the blue, and actually, Shuntaro Furukawa pretty much pointed to this a couple of weeks ago at the most recent investor Q&A. I quote from Nintendo's own official translation. "We have defined building software assets and foundation for maintaining and expanding relationship with consumers as fields of investment for cash utilization, and various initiatives in both fields are under consideration or have been implemented already. However, investment in the development of the successor to Nintendo Switch has been carried out as part of normal business activities. For this reason, the investments in the successor to Nintendo Switch are not the main focus of our cash utilization. In regard to building software assets, investments in visual content, which is entertainment other than video games, are currently taking precedence in our cash utilization. However, in the future, there may also be video game related investments, and it is possible that this will have something to do with the successor to Nintendo Switch. So it's curious, although they're not prioritizing game development with their investments and are looking more in the field of visual content, there is clearly an interest in acquisitions not to do with the development of hardware, but for building software assets for the machine when it comes out. It is possible that this will have something to do with the successor to the Nintendo Switch. Pretty much gives the game away that whatever Shiver are working on right now, and the announcement confirms that they will be continuing with the other work for different studios for the time being at least, fulfilling projects for work presumably on Xbox and PlayStation, the trajectory is for them to work on the Switch successor console. So what are the facts on the ground with regard to the latest star in Nintendo's sky? I've found it difficult to securely establish just how large the Shiver Entertainment Group are, but lists of credits on various websites put them in the low to mid-20s in terms of number of staff, certainly on the small end, or as they call themselves on their website, a boutique studio where you certainly won't be a cog in a wheel. Next Level Games, by contrast, had over 100 people when Nintendo stepped in, but of course porting games is not quite so time-consuming a project as developing an original title from scratch. Nevertheless, it takes a particular skill set to port titles from one system to another, and particularly when, as with Switch compared to Sony and Microsoft competitors, there is a significant power disparity between the original and the target machine. Also of note is that the company is relatively recent, only just over 10 years old. It's worked on ports of Mortal Kombat 11 and Mortal Kombat 1 and on Hogwarts Legacy. However, it's clear that there is a deep bench of experience in the company, and my hunch is that rather than specifically investing in an air quotes port company, this acquisition is an expression of faith in some specific individuals. Check their website. Shiver leadership has led some of the industry's largest companies and helped shape some of its most successful franchises, including Mortal Kombat, Madden NFL, FIFA, Need for Speed, and Guitar Hero, among others. It's talking about the leadership rather than specifically the games that they've ported, which, although growing in number, is not quite as diverse in terms of iconic titles. Shiver's CEO, John Shappert, left Zynga, where he was the chief operating officer, in 2013 to start the neophyte studio. As reported by GamesIndustry.biz, in 1994, Shappert founded another Florida-based studio, Madden developer Tiburon Entertainment. Since that time, he has served as Microsoft's corporate VP in charge of Xbox Live and Microsoft Game Studios, then moved to Electronic Arts, where he worked as COO. As mentioned most recently, he oversaw product development and daily operations for Zynga. In other words, this is somebody who is very highly connected across the gaming space, and this could be incredibly useful for Nintendo if they want to try to broaden the scope of third-party offerings on their next system. Shiver Entertainment back then were focused on free-to-play games for mobile. At the time of the announcement, the article announcing the company's inception issued the rather pretentious statement, "Shiver is looking for hungry, top-of-the-food-chain developers to make," in its quotes, "great big games." Clearly these ambitions were realised as the transition from being mobile-focused to porting has taken the company in a stark new direction. But to keep the marine metaphor afloat, Nintendo doesn't patrol the waters of the gaming space like a shark scenting blood for its next victim. It's quite rare that it looks to acquire studios, and so there is a reason for it. Embracer Group, the owners, appear to have had a bit of a rocky last few years themselves. At the tail end of 2023, they split into 3 separate, publicly listed companies. The corporate-friendly blurb for this announcement said, "This will enable the entities to unlock value in the high-quality assets of Embracer Group, following the successful completion of the restructuring program." I assume the bit they're not saying is that each wing of the company could also fail separately without it significantly affecting other branches. Of course, in the febrile world in which some of these game companies exist, this means that transitions and acquisitions aren't uncommon, and Shiver itself was only acquired by the Embracer Group in 2021. So let's look a little bit further from the Nintendo end of the telescope. First of all, this is a blip on the landscape for the company in terms of its financial outlook, a tiny studio on the opposite side of the planet. As they say themselves, the acquisition will have only a minor effect on Nintendo's results for the financial year. Nor, on paper, are Shiver the ripest prospects for acquisition. Surely the kings of Switch ports have to be the estimable people of Panic Button Games, famed for Wolfenstein, Doom, and others. As Nintendo mentioned in their investor Q&A, this builds the opportunity to have deeper investments with their consumers. The more big games that can be brought to their console, the wider they can cast the net in terms of people's interests. Also, having their own port studio has some specific advantages for Nintendo, even if it's not quite as big as Panic Button. First of all, they can have a centre of excellence and almost a consultation studio which can be used to troubleshoot for other game developers. Florida's time zone puts it to the east of America and Australia, but to the west of Europe, and assuming many European developers outside the UK and Ireland also speak English, at least for business purposes as a second language, this makes the studio ideally positioned not just to have their own stable of developed titles, but also to support other developers on both sides of the Atlantic in as close as possible to their own office hours. With a new console, there is necessarily a lag time for the development of titles as studios get used to the new technology, and so having an experienced port team already knee-deep in the Switch successor's technology will doubtless be of great use. The advantage to this, it seems to me, is not really in the AAA space. Panic Button doesn't have anything to worry about because that company is taking the absolute behemoth titles and taming them for Switch, but for a great many companies with thin margins, the prospects of porting their PS5 or Xbox title to the Switch successor may seem tantalizing but too expensive a hurdle to overcome initially. By taking simple steps to lower this hurdle, Nintendo not only can ensure a greater flow of games onto the new system, but they can also have a knock-on effect for the health of smaller third-party game studios. In a period of some uncertainty for the gaming industry with significant layoffs and downsizing, it's quite possible that there are a number of smaller startups who are interested in making games for Nintendo but concerned about whether Nintendo would be an ideal location and whether it would be better to focus their efforts on the slightly more harmonized Xbox and PlayStation 5 level of technology. It's not just about quantity of titles though, it's also about quality. This is a long-standing concern, and while Nintendo hasn't seemed to be overly concerned about the surfeit of so-called shovelware on the Switch eShop, the lack of quality third-party porting was something that did trouble them in the past. Back in 2007, Shigeru Miyamoto was quoted by GameDeveloper.com. He said, "If there's one piece of advice that I could give to the managers of third-party companies, it would be that a lot of times it seems that when they're putting games out on Nintendo hardware, those games are being developed by their third-string team or their fourth string team. Maybe that's because they see these products as being unique projects or somewhat smaller scale projects. But when Nintendo puts out a title that is designed to really support and sell its hardware, that title is always developed by one of our number one teams. And so I think that when it comes to the question of trying to compete with our software, I would really like to see the parties try to do that with their number one teams rather than with their third or fourth string teams. And look, it only makes sense. It's pointless having ports of third-party titles on Switch or the Switch successor if those ports aren't up to the standards of other systems or up to the standards of Nintendo themselves. Inevitably, after its launch, Nintendo's new system will age, while Sony and Microsoft will continue to plow onward with new technology. And so when the new system launches, the gap between the Nintendo system technology and the current cutting edge with PlayStation and Xbox will be closer then than it will be for a very long time afterwards. Therefore, investment now in building strong resources for people making ports will allow Nintendo to have a steady flow of business and a team that is already trustworthy when the prospect of trying much more ambitious ports, perhaps from PlayStation 6, comes into play several years from now. In many respects then, this seems like a move less on par with the acquisition of Monolith Soft or Next Level Games and more equivalent to their deal with Forever Entertainment. Although this wasn't a purchasing arrangement, it was a publishing deal that stood down some of the gatekeepers for third-party, and in that case, particularly indie developers bringing games to Switch. Therefore, I'd recommend checking out this video on screen for more, and in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again for another Nintendo Forecast.